Hello, we are back with 2.5, kicking it off where we left off after class. So, during class, we introduced rate of return. Now, rate of return is a phenomenal way to compare two investments or three investments or four investments together to determine which one is better. Which one will give you the most amount of money back based on what you've put in. However, rate of return does have some pitfalls. It does not account for the amount of time the money has been invested for. So if we're taking a look at that, sometimes we might get a rate of return of something really, really high, like a 75%. And that sounds really good. But when I take a look at that, the time that it took to get me to that 75% of rate of return really makes a difference. If it took me 25 years to get there, so 75 divided by 25, that's about 3% return per year. Which you might think, like, yeah, it's not too bad. Like 3% per year, that's almost the same as like a savings account interest rate. But let's say, for example, you did 75% rate of return, and you did that only in 5 years. That means on average, 75 divided by 5, that's 15% rate of return back every single year. So rate of return does not accommodate how long it took you to get there. However, there's one slight adjustment we can make. Instead of calculating rate of return, we can calculate average annual rate of return. So if we make a return of 75%, what's the average annual rate of return we would make back? What's the rate of return we would have made each year? Now, when we're talking about investments can vary from year to year. That's why the word average is thrown in there. Just like average rate of return was thrown into rate of return sometimes. The key difference of this language is the fact that I have the word annual in there. So when I'm talking about average annual rate of return, that's the difference between this and what we were doing before. If it does not have the word annual in there, or rate of return for each year, or something that indicates that I'm talking about a yearly rate of return as opposed to over the whole span of time, if I don't have any of those per year vocab words involved, then I'm just talking about regular rate of return. Okay, average annual rate of return, super easy peasy once we have rate of return, because all we do is we take that rate of return and we divide it by the total number of years we've invested that money for. All right, let's take a look. We've got 2 examples left, and those examples are going to be pretty generous to us. First one, we've got Pirate Jack Johnson. He invests $45,000 of his treasure into mutual funds. Very smart pirate. After a very successful 7 years, he withdraws his investment and ends up with $152,798. What is Pirate Jack Johnson's, average annual rate of return? So, before we could ever find average annual rate of return, we always have to find the rate of return. That's always going to be your first step. Now, if it was given to us, easy peasy, just divide by the number of years. But very rarely are we going to be given most of the work done for us. So, let's take a look. We know that rate of return is equal to my dollar amount of interest divided by my total amount of money invested, and that quotient times by 100%. Now, I'm not told the amount of interest that Pirate Jack Johnson has earned, but I'm told his end amount and his starting amount, right? So I can just simply subtract those two values to get that dollar amount worth of interest. So I'm going to do that all in one step here in my numerator. So I have the $152,798 divided by that $45,000. That will be and give me my interest. My denominator is just the amount he's invested, and that's just told to me straight up in the question. So this question is quite the generous question. I do want you to plug this in, though, because this is where a lot of mistakes happen. Now, if you plug this in as 152,798 minus 45,000 divided by 45,000 times by 100, you're going to get a potential mistake in your answer. Now, something that's really, really crucial is whenever I have a numerator and a denominator, just know that there's always invisible brackets there. Now, we can see it because in our calculator, and on our page, it's written as a fraction. So we know it's there. We know to deal with that numerator before we do the division. But our calculators don't know that if we don't have it looking like a fraction in that calculator. So we have to imply or put in those brackets when we plug it in. So please go ahead, plug it in, and I'm going to plug it in here too. And I end up getting 239.55111%. Now notice I didn't round here because this is not my final answer. I'm not looking for rate of return. I'm looking for average annual rate of return. So this is step 2. Just like how we were able to represent rate of return as R of R, I will represent annual average rate of return as AA, R of R. Which still seems quite long, but hey, it's much shorter than the alternative of writing it out. And remember that formula is just my rate of return divided by the number of years. And that's pretty cool, pretty easy to do. That's 239.55111% divided by, how many years did we have it? 7 years. Good for you, Pirate Jack Johnson. Because when you do that division and round to the 2 decimal places, because this is now going to be my final answer, you get 34.22% as your average annual rate of return, which I must say is nearly unheard of. So when investing in his mutual funds has like a whole variety of things he invests in, probably had some pretty good stocks in there, and the stocks must have just skyrocketed. Much better than being a pirate. So good for you, Jack Johnson. All right, and this here is my final answer. All right, we've got one last example, and we've got Terry the trainer. He decides to purchase 6 shares of a new running shoe company called Bounce for $2,900 each. So something to keep in mind, he has 6 shares, and each share is worth this amount. So it's not the total is $2,900, but each of those 6 shares is $2,900. Unfortunately, the company doesn't do so well, and after 3 years, Terry withdraws his money and is only left with $17,200. What is Terry's rate of return and his average annual rate of return? So, we're going to do all those calculations, don't you worry, but I do want to know the total he invested. So, the total dollars that Terry invested, Terry the trainer specifically, was not just the $2,900, it's 6 times the $2,900 because he invested 6 shares each worth that value. When I plug that into my calculator, I know that Terry has invested a grand total of $17,400. Now, I don't have any TVM to do, I don't have any simple interest calculations to do because all the information is provided to me in the question. I could simply calculate my rate of return. My rate of return, again, that formula is the total dollars worth of interest. And I'm dividing it by the total dollars invested. And we're multiplying it by 100. Now, this is very, very important. Because when I'm talking about the total dollar number of interest that I earned, that's the difference between my final amount and my initial amount. And this is where it's very important. My final amount is $17,200 and my initial amount is $17,400. Now you might already notice, but we're going to end up with a negative number in our numerator. And that is okay. When we are taking a look at this, do not just say, I don't want negatives. I'm going to get rid of them and change the order. No, you can't. The order of subtraction matters so much. Now, this means we're going to get a negative rate of return, and that is okay because Terry is losing money. So his rate of return isn't going to be positive because that would imply gaining money. It's not going to be 0 because he didn't stay the same. It's going to be negative. And that is okay. Please tell yourself whatever you need to believe that that is going to be okay. Don't change the numbers because you don't like what you see. Okay. So that is how I calculate my dollar amount of interest. Final minus initial. What he ends up with minus what he started off with. Whew. Now we're good. Now my denominator is that total dollar amount invested, which still happens to be that $17,400. And I'm multiplying by 100%. Gentle, quite strong reminder that when I'm plugging this in, numerator and denominator have to be in those secret brackets when I plug them in. Otherwise, you may not get the appropriate final answer. When we do that, plug it in, see what you get. I get a negative 1.149425%. Now, the question is asking me for the rate of return and the average annual rate of return. So because this is part of my final answer, I am going to round here as well. But I'm going to use the non-rounded version in my second part of the example. So since I have 2 pieces of information that I want to find, not just the end game of average annual rate of return, I'm going to make sure both of my answers have 2 decimal places. Of course, in my calculations for my average annual being my rate of return divided by my number of years, I'm going to use that non-rounded version. So, let's roll with it. I have negative 1.49. Nope, I forgot a 1. Negative 1.14945. Did I write that down properly this time? Sure did. Percent. Divided by my number of years. So Terry the trainer had invested that over the span of 3 years. So we're going to divide that number by 3. And we're still expecting a negative, right? A negative divided by a positive still going to get me that negative. And again, that is okay. And this is my final answer. I'm not going to do anything further with it. So I am going to round it to 2 decimal places right away. So Terry ends up losing about 0.38% every year. And that's what that negative implies, that he is losing money. And here's my final answer. So thanks for watching about rate of return and annual average rate of return. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Make sure that coming up you are aware that there is a quiz coming, so preparing for that is super crucial. We will chat more about that via Teams. All right, so long, farewell. Bye.